Good morning, and thank you all for coming this morning to hear us talk about Richard Glossip, an innocent man who is scheduled to be executed by the state of Oklahoma in just 65 days. That so many of you would come here this morning heartens me and shows me that the people of Oklahoma care about justice, and they care about innocence, and they care about Richard Glossip. Thank you. Before I start the remarks I have, I do want to say one thing. On January 7th, 1997, Barry Van Treese was murdered. Nothing that I will say today is in any way intended to diminish Barry Van Treese's life or the suffering that his family has felt ever since that horrible day. I think a fair way to begin is to talk about why am I here? Why is there a lawyer from Littleton, Colorado, standing in the State House in Oklahoma talking about Richard Glossip and the fact that he's innocent? It was last October. It was in the evening, and I was pulling into a restaurant. I was going to go grab a bite to eat. My telephone rang, and it was Sister Helen Prejean on the line. And she began by telling me about the situation that she got herself involved in. This man had written her from prison. This man said, "I'm innocent. Please help. I've just got done with my clemency hearing. They're going to schedule an execution date. Will you come?" Helen did. Helen went to see him. And then she called me. And she said, "Don, I know there's a lawyer involved in this case. And her name is Kathleen Lord. And Kathleen Lord is working on this case without being paid. And can you help?" And I said, "Geez, Helen, I'm awfully busy. I got a lot going on. Go to Oklahoma." And she said, "Yeah, but you know what? Richard Glossip is innocent. And we've got to stop this. We've got to do something." So I told her I'd try. I said, "Okay, I'll take a look at what you got." Kathleen Lord happens to be in Denver, so we were able to work together. And Helen brought in another lawyer named Mark Olive to help us on this case as well. And together the three of us began to put together the very old case that we have to work on here today. As I began to look at the evidence in this case, I have to admit that chills ran down my spine. This was a very, very sad, a very difficult case, a case clearly not in the league to be a death penalty case. And yet it appeared that that's where this was headed. What I first noticed when I started on this investigation was the investigation itself. It was a deeply flawed investigation from the start. The first thing I noticed was the other possible suspects that were at the motel or around the motel on the morning in question. This murder took place in the early morning hours of January 7th, 1997. At that time, the Best Budget Inn catered to a lower class clientele. The truth be known, there were many unsavory characters there. To name just a few of them, one was a man named Richard Page. Richard Page had a long criminal history, including a murder that took place in Arkansas, where Mr. Page was accused and convicted of beating a man to death with a blunt object for money. Mr. Page received 10 years in the Arkansas Department of Corrections for this murder. Mr. Page testified at a preliminary hearing in this case, and Mr. Page said at that time he often went into room 102, which is the room where Barry Van Treese was murdered. And what he did there was buy drugs. He bought drugs from Bobby Glossip. Bobby Glossip was Richard Glossip's brother, who often stayed in room 102. Bobby Glossip manufactured and sold methamphetamine. Bobby Glossip knew Richard Page, and Richard Page knew Bobby Glossip, and they often dealt drugs together. Bobby Glossip also had a violent past. Another man who was present at or around the motel at that time was a man named Richard Barrett, another guy with a long criminal history of violence and prison time. There was also some man who left the motel sometime around 4 o'clock that morning, seemed to be in a hurry. Another employee of the motel happened to be at a Sinclair station just across the way and said that some man came in and needed to get to Cody, Wyoming, and he needed to get there very quickly. How could he get out? At this point in time, I don't know who that person was. There were also some strange things that I noticed, some just things that bothered me when I looked at this investigation. There was an officer named Tim Brown, who was the first one to discover the body at 10 o'clock at night on January the 7th. Officer Brown said that when he got to the room 102, he tried to open the door, but he couldn't open the door because the tumbler in the lock had been taken out of the door. His report says he had to use a pair of hemostats to open the door. And he opened the door, and there he saw the body of Barry Van Treese. The allegation in this case is that this was a murder that took place for purposes of robbery. Justin Sneed says he stole $4,000. At least that was the figure he finally settled on when he robbed Barry Van Treese. A very strange thing about this case that came up when I was looking through this information was there was $23,100 in cash in Barry Van Treese's trunk. Some of that money had blue dye on it. Blue dye is what happens when money comes from a bank robbery and the dye pack explodes on the money. So as far as I know, an unexplained circumstance as far as this case is concerned. But one wonders, if robbery was the motive, how did that money not get picked up? And what was money, $23,100, doing in Barry Van Treese's trunk with blue dye on it? These are the kind of things that made me wonder, well, what kind of an investigation was done in this case? When I looked it over, it seemed to me to come down to a very, very simple investigation. The truth is, Richard Glossip made some mistakes on that morning. Richard Glossip was used to running a motel. It had, like I said, a lot of unsavory characters. And when the police come around, you don't always tell them everything you know. Richard Glossip had been told earlier that morning by Justin Sneed that he had just killed Barry Van Treese. Richard said he kind of blew it off. He said, you had to know Justin. You just had to know him. There was no reason for me to believe him. After all, Barry wasn't even supposed to be there. He had left at 8 o'clock at night the night before to drive to Tulsa, where he had another motel. So Richard said he just kind of blew that off. Well, when the police came around later that day and started to look for Barry because his car was there, Richard did not tell the police that bit of information. That was a mistake that Richard made. He admits that that was a mistake that he made. That does not mean that he had knowledge of the homicide, because he didn't have any knowledge of this homicide. Instead, once the police saw that Richard was not necessarily telling them the whole truth, they began to focus in on Richard. But the funny thing is, later that night, after the body was found, and Richard was in the squad car of Tim Brown. He immediately told Tim Brown, I should have told you. Justin Sneed had told me earlier that he had killed Barry Van Treese. So almost immediately after the body is found, Richard Glossip says, this is what I know. This is what I know. The police then immediately began to focus in on Justin Sneed. It took a week to arrest Justin Sneed. He was hanging out with the group of roofers that he had come to Oklahoma with from Texas. And they found him there, and they brought him to the station. And they questioned him about this murder. Justin Sneed has not always told the truth in this case. In fact, Justin Sneed has often not told the truth. When initially asked by the police at the station, what do you know about this? His answer was, I don't know anything. I don't know anything. Did you kill him? No, I didn't kill him. Are you telling me that you didn't kill Barry Van Treese? Yes, that's what I said. So right off the bat, we know that Justin Sneed is capable of lying to try to help himself. But I'm not here. I am not here to bash on Justin Sneed today. Justin Sneed was a 19-year-old at the time. A poor guy, came with this roofing crew. I've done a little investigation into his background. It looks like a pretty tough background. Justin Sneed probably feels like he has reasons to make sure that he takes care of himself first. And when the police started to ask questions, well, come on, why don't you tell us who else was involved? We have a feeling Richard Glossip was involved. Why don't you tell us Richard Glossip was involved? Justin Sneed did the thing he needed to do for himself, and he began to point the finger at Richard Glossip. The thing that really stands out in this case, to me, as somebody who has done death penalty work for the last 15 years, is how uncertain the evidence is. And yet, a decision to pursue the death penalty was made and carried out. You would think that we would want the death penalty to be reserved for just a certain class of people, a very certain class of people, the worst of the worst, in cases where guilt is just not an issue. But this case relies solely upon the evidence and the testimony of one man who has admitted to being the murderer and who is now spending the rest of his life in a medium security facility in Oklahoma, while the person that he pointed the finger at is scheduled to be executed in 65 days. As I looked at this case, I also saw evidence of stressed and underpaid lawyers. People are going to say, but hey, wait a minute. He had a trial. He actually had two, but the first one didn't take long to be overturned on appeal for ineffective assistance of counsel. The second lawyers were from essentially the Oklahoma Public Defender's Office. Good people who work hard. And I'm not going to say anything bad about these folks because they do work hard. But this is an underfunded organization. I mentioned to you the various things that should have been done as far as an investigation was concerned in this case. As a defense lawyer, when we see things that need to be done in an investigation that weren't by the police, our job is to go out and do that investigation. We have to. We can't just take the word of the police officers and have that be that. I don't believe the office that represented Richard Glossip in his second trial had the resources to do what needed to be done in this case. It was easy to say this case hinges upon Justin Sneed, because it does. That's all there is to this case, Justin Sneed. And so therefore, if I can do an effective cross-examination of Justin Sneed, we can get a not guilty verdict. Sometimes it takes more, especially if you have people who you could call alternate suspects. That can really help a jury to focus on the fact that it's not only the person who's been charged. He's not only not guilty, but maybe somebody else had something to do with this. I can tell you now, we are trying very, very hard to get investigators out, to talk to witnesses. But it's been 17 years. Many of the witnesses that we already want to talk to have died. It's going to be very difficult for us to piece together what happened so long ago. The three things that I just mentioned, a poor investigation, the use of basically a snitch, and an underfunded defense, are three of the main reasons that Justice Breyer just made kind of a broadside attack on the death penalty in Glossip v. Gross, the case that decided that Oklahoma could use the drug cocktail that they're going to use on September 16th. This was a case about lethal injection. It wasn't a case about the death penalty. It wasn't a case about innocence. It was a case about lethal injection. The lead plaintiff here is Glossip, Richard Glossip. And that's the case that Justice Breyer said, I'm going to talk about innocence. I'm going to talk about why people who are innocent still get convicted in this country of crimes that they didn't do. And we know that. We know that. From the Innocence Project on down, we have found a lot of people who are on death row who actually were innocent. And we know, in fact, that there were some who were killed despite the fact that they were innocent. Last year alone, 6 death row inmates were completely exonerated in this country. Exonerated. They were tried, they were convicted by a jury, maybe they were convicted by more than one. But after years and years and good hard investigation, and perhaps the luck of having DNA, it was found that in fact the guilty verdict was wrong. The jury got it wrong, because they can, because they're human too. In his dissent, Justice Breyer wrote, in comparing those who were exonerated from death row to other capital defendants who were not so exonerated, the initial police investigations tended to be shorter for those who were exonerated. This investigation, as I've said, was very short. Discussing other common causes of wrongful convictions generally include false confessions, mistaken eyewitness testimony, untruthful jailhouse informants, and ineffective assistance of defense counsel. As I've said, these are all the things that are present in this case. And I think it's interesting that Justice Breyer chose this case to talk about these things. As I dug deeper into this case, I also noticed how arbitrary this death sentence is. What do we mean by arbitrary? In Oklahoma, every year, just like everywhere else in the country, many, many murders happen. It's a sad fact of our lives. The death penalty is supposed to be reserved, as I said, for the worst of the worst. Justice Breyer quoted another Supreme Court case, Kennedy versus Louisiana, when he said capital punishment must be limited to those offenders who commit a narrow category of the most serious crimes and whose extreme culpability makes them most deserving of execution. Obviously, Richard Glossip is not in that category. To begin with, and again, I want to emphasize, there's no disrespect meant to the Barry Van Treese family. Their pain is very real and very difficult for them. But this murder was a single murder carried out by Justin Sneed, who admitted to doing so. It was a murder for money. As Justin Sneed said, he stole money from Barry Van Treese. Took about $4,000 from him. This is not a murder where there were multiple victims. In fact, if you look back in Oklahoma's history, and you talk about the worst of the worst, Terry Nichols, I believe, was tried down in McAllister for that horrible day in Oklahoma City. The death penalty was sought in that case, and the jury came back and said no. They did not give Terry Nichols the death penalty. How can one compare what he did and what Richard Glossip did, or what, I should say, Justin Sneed did and what Richard Glossip is accused of doing? Richard Page is another good example. As I said, Richard Page, a person who was there, murdered a man in Arkansas with a blunt object and stole money. Sounds an awful lot like what happened here. The state of Arkansas decided that after he was guilty, he should receive a 10-year sentence. Richard Glossip is sitting on death row. Richard Glossip had never had a crime he was accused of or convicted of before this took place. This is a situation where a man who'd never been in a jail cell before, let alone a prison, suddenly went to death row. This crime was not the worst. This man was not the worst. This case is far from the worst of the worst. Ever since that day, Richard Glossip has been a model prisoner, showing that the jury was right when they said he did not pose a future danger at all in this case. So after looking at this case and the facts of the case, I did have to conclude, I had to say, you know, Richard Glossip is innocent. He didn't do this. There isn't enough evidence. When you look at the prosecution's theory of the case, that in and of itself just doesn't make a lot of sense. The prosecution's theory of the case is Richard Glossip knew that he might be fired from the job that he had at Barry Van Treese's motel, and he was worried about that. And he had this idea, and this idea said, if I can kill Barry Van Treese, maybe I can go on ahead and keep working here. And Justin Sneed later on said, well, maybe you could even work at the motel up in Tulsa, and you could run them both. And you could make a lot of money doing that. Who would think that if you killed the owner, your boss, that somehow or another you would even be guaranteed that you would keep your job, let alone somehow advance your position? That doesn't make any sense. The next thing that Justin Sneed said is that he did this for the money. That Richard told Justin he's going to have some money on him, $4,000. Steal that from him. We'll split it. Barry Van Treese came to that motel earlier on the night of January 6th to do the things he normally does, which is to pay the people who work there. He comes every couple of weeks, get the receipts. The receipts came to $4,000 cash. Those receipts were given to him by Richard Glossip. in the prosecution's case, they want you to believe that Richard Glossip, instead of simply walking away with $4,000, where, if he's caught, he might face a theft charge, instead decided to have Justin Sneed kill Barry Van after giving him the $4,000 and then getting $1,700 back. So he gets less than half the money and the murder charge all at the same time. Again, that doesn't make any sense. The final point that just simply doesn't make any sense, and this has been bugging me for a while. Poor Barry Van Treese was murdered and left in room 102. It was a terrible scene, a terrible scene. He was beaten to death with a baseball bat. As I said, when Richard Glossip was placed in the back of the patrol car after they found the body, the first thing he said was, you know, it was Justin. He told me. He told me. He did this. If you thought about it, if it was true what the prosecution said, that Justin Sneed had been hired or recruited by Richard to do this homicide, and to do it there in room 102, you would think that they would have had a plan to say, well, somebody broke in. We don't know who. How did this happen? The last thing you would think that a man like Richard Glossip, who is supposedly the mastermind of this, would want to do is to tell everybody that the person who told him, after having done it, Justin Sneed, that he in fact did it, he would know full well that Justin Sneed would circle right back around and say Richard Glossip did it. That doesn't make any sense either. What really happened in the early morning hours to Barry Van Treese? It's very, very difficult to say it this many years down the road. Like I said, this was a place with many unsavory characters. Barry Van Treese was known to have cash. Maybe a lot of cash, apparently a lot of cash. There are people in that motel who have been involved in things like theft before and things like murder before. There are certainly alternate people, alternate theories that could have been and should have been run down in this case. Richard Glossip's conviction here is the result of mistakes and flaws in our capital punishment system. They're well pointed out by Justice Breyer in his dissent in Glossip v. Gross. Richard Glossip is in fact innocent. He certainly made mistakes. He'll own those mistakes. But those mistakes don't mean that this man should be killed by the state of Oklahoma. He's scheduled to die in 65 days. We've got 3 lawyers who are dedicated to trying everything that we can do to help his situation and to stop what's going to happen. But we need help. We need a lot of help. There were people who were at that motel that night who might still be around. Or there are people who talk to people who may have been at that motel that night who can tell us some things that we don't already know. Justin Sneed could help. Justin Sneed could really help by coming forward and saying, let me tell you, Richard Glossip didn't do this. I'm sorry. Sorry for what I said. If there are people out there that want to donate, please visit Richard Glossip's website and do so. All the money that we get will go to investigator fees and expenses of this investigation that needs to happen, and needs to happen quick. And right now, we don't have much money. As I said, I came here from Colorado, and I wondered to myself as I thought about this conference today, and I thought, why should the people of the state of Oklahoma listen to me? You folks know what you're doing. You feel the way you feel about the death penalty. I understand that. I respect that. But I thought about that, and I thought, there's one thing that we can agree upon. There's one thing that everybody can agree upon. Whether you're for the death penalty or you're against the death penalty, there's one thing. No one, not from Oklahoma or Colorado or anywhere else in this country, no one wants to see an innocent man die at the hands of the state. We have to do all we can now to stop this. There's not much time. Please help us.